Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Thursday morning keynote. My name is Andreas Oberndacher, and I'm the head of the Unit for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Innsbruck. Before I introduce my dear colleague Marko Lehti, I would like to start with some rather personal remarks, as we have also heard repeatedly throughout the last few days, starting with the first keynote on Monday evening, but also listening to Alexandra's keynote yesterday. The narratives and the voices of those that do not speak loudly do matter, and it matters to us also to listening to them. This means that at times of war, we often forget about children, about elderly people, but also about disabled people, people that have fallen sick. I start with this very personal remark because this afternoon I will be attending a funeral. It is a funeral dedicated to the memory of a good friend of mine with whom I used to grow up and who has fallen sick, unfortunately, and eventually died. But despite this sadness, I can still take it for granted that I can attend his funeral, that we can share his memory, that his family and friends will be present, that he also received care in his last years of his life. But this is not the case if we think of the many people that were forcefully disappeared, that were made to disappear, that do not receive the treatment that they actually need because they find themselves in the middle of a war situation or because of structural injustices. So I think that also these stories do matter, and it matters to us also to tell other stories, to resist this loud voice of war and violence. This brings me to today's keynote by my dear colleague Marko Lehti, who is known to many of you as a distinguished scholar, but also as a passionate advocate for peace and understanding. He is the research director of one of the main pillars of that what we may call perhaps the Nordic tradition of peace building. So next to Prio and Sipri, Marko is the research director at Tampere Peace Research Institute, shortly TAPRI, and also the academic director of the master's program in peace, mediation, and conflict research at Tampere University. He plans rigorous research with a heartfelt commitment to making a difference in this world. His work on peace mediation, especially agonistic peace building and multilateralism, reflects a deep curiosity about how conflicts arise, how they develop, and more importantly, how they can be transformed through mediation, dialogue, and an active striving to making this a better world. Throughout his career, Marko has ventured in diverse regions, from the Baltic countries to the South Caucasus, Ukraine, and the Balkans, gaining thus unique insights into transnational encounters and the evolution of collective identities. Among the many publications that I could quote here, let me briefly refer to Nordic Peace in Question, a region of and for peace, that was published only last year and that he co-edited with Browning and Strang, or The Era of Private Peacemakers, a monograph that was published in 2019, and Contestations of Liberal Order, The Western Crisis, co-edited with Pennanen and Yuki. All of this and many other publications underscore his innovative approach to understanding contemporary global challenges. Marko's leadership in projects like the Erasmus-funded project Peace Edu, some of its members are here, demonstrates his belief in the transformative power of peace education and the relevance of peace education as part of peace building. His engaging presence and dedication continues to inspire students, colleagues, and communities in the shared journey toward a more peaceful world. Please welcome Marko Lehti here in Innsbruck.
Thank you for your kind words. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I'm impressed up after this to starting this. It is really a great opportunity to give this keynote, and I'm really honored to be here. I have also enjoyed a lot of a conference so far and learned a lot. And have to say that even I'm working with a peace education project, I'm not an expert in peace education. This is not my field. I'm learning about it and what it means. Personally, as Andres already explained it, my research has been focused on peace building, peace mediation, and global order or world ordering, and that is probably where I'm now also today focusing. I'm trying to combine with something of my kind of understanding or critical perspective to peace building, something new which I've been learning about the pluriversality or the peace, to adopting something, how we coping with the plurality of ideas, and then coming up what I've been working for a very long time with the agonistic perspective. And I'm using this as really as an opportunity to combine these different elements together. To start, I think it's where my focus is really a concept of peace. We have been discussing throughout the days about the peace, and mentioned I don't know how many times, but quite often it's mentioned without not giving a very thorough thinking what we mean that with the whole concept, and how we gain the knowledge about what it mean to gain the knowledge of peace, and how we get the knowledge how to make the peace. And this is a question where I would kind of concentrate today. And indeed, I think the peace is really powerful concept that is essential for all human communities. It is really kind of an empowering concept with various interpretations that evolve through the experiences and practices of individual communities and institutions. And peace encompasses both everyday experiences, but also mediating practices at the global level. And if I think about my own way of understanding peace, is that the peace is fundamentally relational and something that prevails and evolves in practices. And peace can be seen as a practice. Peace is then agonistic relation enabling coexistence, co-living, and even co-creating the world with your adversaries. Peace is then system of practices mitigating, suspending, diluting, and transforming what I call a radical antagonism into agonistic relations. I will return on that later on, but this is how I'm understanding and trying to define the peace. And I've been introduced that is offering an also ontological perspective to research and the study of peace, but have also a pragmatic edge that maybe in this way we kind of find a new way of thinking about the peace building. But then the question is what it means to understand peace in plural. Plurality of a peace is often presented as an argument to contest hegemony of a liberal peace. It has a strong decolonizing tendency, but call for plurality or pluriversality contest all fixed positions to produce knowledge about the peace. It opens a radical relational perspective to peace and peace building in which there is no objective definition of peace, and in which understanding of other position, even they are something you are not agreeing with, becoming relevant. I am proposing that, and that my best as understanding peace as a primary, as a practice, is something that can be found in practice, is perhaps helping on coping with this kind of a methodological and ontological perspective of plurality. And let me explain that in short. But before going on more on discussion of ontological and epistemological question, I want to start about the reflecting what is going on in the world at the moment. And that was my original purpose also, but I have been reading the news in the past few days. I've been more and more experiencing and be more convinced that we are witnessing at the moment the really a drastic end or something which we call normative order relying on liberal peace. And it's mostly because of the the Trump's regimes, in the President Trump's regime's kind of a way of approaching and peace and how this is discussing of the peace, but also how it is in kind of generating and different processes to setting the peace in Ukraine and in Gaza. The things has taken a surprising kind of shift, and day after day, I don't know where it ended about. It's sounding, and yesterday, it started to be a bit a nightmare. What I was interpreting that in yesterday, the Trump allies with the Putin against Ukraine. This is how I was seeing the things in what happens. And already, if you followed and earlier on during the past few weeks, it started a discussion about very weird initiatives about the peace in Gaza, and then followed about some ideas how the peace in Ukraine can be started to negotiate without the Ukrainian participation, only with the great powers. Not going into details in that, but what is interesting here, and what comes up with this presentation, is that at the same time that Trump wants to be peacemaker, he has even some kind of obsession toward the Nobel Peace Prize. And he has a certain kind of understanding of peace, but it's very narrow, it's very state-centric, it's very much kind of American security first thinking. But I think that perhaps it's among all is imperialistic. And that is not perhaps a surprise that the Putin and Trump have found they kind of common understanding that because their understanding is peace is very, very common, to close to each other's. And this is very threatening kind of development in international order. But it's not only about the Trump. The change in international order have taken already for several years. We have witnessing a drastic changes in how the world is ordered, but how peace and peace building is also understood. I find it well justified to argue that it world that ended in the new post-liberal era that is certainly also less Western. If we rise the rest, it can be described with also shift from unipolarity to multipolarity, or multiplexity, as Amitav Acharya calls it. Some years back, Acharya argues that the increase of a multiplicity of global actors would contribute to evolving a more just and peaceful world. But unfortunately, that is seemingly not the case. The new plural world has, however, contradicting elements and tendencies. On the one hand, it is characterized by rise of authoritarian regimes, illiberal norms, decline of democracy, and the emergence of new non-Western forms of imperialism and colonialism. In this regard, we are moving towards the world in which inequality among the states increases, in which muscles matter more than the principles, and in which civil society engagement becomes even more difficult. The logic of geopolitics and geoeconomics is paralyzing the remaining capacity of international organizations to intervene, mediate, prevent, and sustain peace. But we should explore the evolving world and uncertainty around it beyond the logic of a power polarity and give attention to emergence of plurality of agencies and relationships contributing to plurality of norms and ontology of peace. There are emerging a rich and plural non-profit sector in peace building in the global south, and what we call a diverse peace ecosystems. Furthermore, throughout the global south, local actors have in increasing manner gained trust that change should be locally made and owned, even there where civil society's actors' agencies is limited by authoritarian regimes. Traditional and religious peacemakers are gaining appreciation. Peace and peace-building are approached from more pluralistic perspective, combining local tradition, but also gaining something from prevailing liberal norms. A good example is African Conference for Peace organized in Nouakchott, Mauritania in January this year. It was follow-up the first conference held in 2020, which created a Nouakchott declaration calling for devising enlightened solution based on African cultures and heritage. The three-day conference this year brought together over 250 leaders and actors, predominantly only from African states, to discuss issues affecting African societies. So things are happening beyond the Europe and beyond the transatlantic ratios without us. Beyond geopolitical and geoeconomic, we are witnessing also diversification and pluralization of agencies, but also epistemological, ontological perspectives, what is understood as a peace and what need for building a peace. As a hegemony of a liberal methodological perspective is cracking, it reveals plurality it has suppressed, but also new dynamics of a plurality are evolving. Even liberal peace is, with its universal and normative framework, has been from a good reason severely contested. We are not probably witnessing the fatal end of a long tradition of liberal peace, but perhaps its revision, adaptations to less Western world, and multiplication of a liberal peace. Instead of a full reaction of a liberal hybrid, a new hybrid discourse on peace is evolving, in my opinion, that still carries liberal vocabulary, but in which signification is transformed and adapted to new context and given new significations. Polarization of a liberal peace reminds what Samuel Eisenstadt's idea about the multiple modernities. Instead of a single Western modernity, modernity has different origins and ownership, and this concern also now with the liberal peace ideas. A good example is how inclusion is discussed, for example, within the Chinese foreign policy context. They are used, the inclusion as a term not referring to the civil society participation, but as a counter-hegemonic argument to the call for participation of a more global South states to the global governance institutions. So it's becoming an argument within the state level. Simultaneously for many, but still we have to say that simultaneously many social movements and activists and non-governmental organizations in global South, for them the human rights in very liberal sense are very essential part of their work. Question is about the ownership, I think, and the power to define what each liberal norms means and who have the right to promote them. And that is we are witnessing diversification of this kind of power of using the terms and re-owning them. The liberal peace discourse loses its ground. It is not replaced by new hegemony of norms, but instead emerges plurality. Is characterized as this kind of some kind of a normative and conceptual mesh that we are witnessing. One outcome of evolving normative mesh is that as a common normative a kind of a basis for legitimizing, mandating, and designing peace building is severely contested, and they're becoming challenging to imagine a new international comprehensive peace processes. And I think that in this moment there's urgent need for reimagining what peace building could mean in new plural world. When they come up, they're declining the West, think about, I need to have a couple words then to explaining the declining Western liberal order and a kind of before we can go on further on. Declining Western liberal order certainly has been a very controversial order. There are two ground narratives available. The liberal ethos that emphasizes how normative backbone of a liberal international order lies on multilateralism, promotion of human rights and democracy, and rules-based order over power politics. Explored from a more critical perspective, liberal order is only pursuing liberal social purposes, is substantially intrusive or interventionary, and liberal order is from justified reason criticized for working in favor of the Western societies and elites, having a neoliberal flavor with significant distributional effects, applying a double standard, and institutionalizing state inequality. But it's still good to remember that the liberal peace is not a theory, it's not a dogma. But what it is called as a liberal peace is widely shared normative understanding on what is required for building more peaceful world, or more precisely of as epistemological and an ontological perspective to know what is needed for achieving sustainable peace. In critical literature, liberal peace is not too often identified, in my opinion, only with a neoliberal governance, but that gives too narrow and one-sided perspective. To understand it, the universalism, epistemological exceptionalism, and privileged position of do-gooder that are written deep into liberal ethos, we need to understand its historical roots in Enlightenment and era of colonialism. And that's why I've given a short historical overview of that. A philosophical origin of a liberal peace can be dated back to European Enlightenment, 200 years back, to Immanuel Kant's idea of a perpetual peace and how it's achievable. Kant's philosophy shifts focus from solving one war to the question of how to prevent all wars. Kant's then given an idea of a League of Peace and republican forms of government and kind of a certain kind of early idea for human rights is kind of a but then these ideas have been changed throughout the 200 years to the emphasis of international organization, democracy, and human rights. But that is not as important. The important is that here in this light on that the dream of a better peace may kind of it's not operative, but that the believing its practicability, and that is a truly modern idea and based on this Enlightenment philosophy, this kind of progressive understanding. Furthermore, what is important here in this early phase, and we carry on this still on this idea, that there are certain universal principles and norms how we can achieve of this kind of world. And this is really carrying on our thinking about peace and what is needed, what kind of organization, what kind of things is needed. In addition to legacy of a progressive philosophy of enlightenment, the current peace planning ethos carries also a strong legacy of classical liberal ideology of the 19th century, with have a very strong colonialist favor. Liberals indeed has a various meanings and interpretation, and even those scholars, activists are fiercely criticizing a neoliberal governance are still labeled as liberals. But the question is what liberalism originally mean in the 19th century. There's a lot about the liberal peace in 21st century. That is my argument. And here I would citate the Helen Rosenblatt book, The Lost History of Liberalism, quote, "At heart, most liberals were moralists. Their liberalism had nothing to do with the atomist individualism we hear of today. They never spoke about the rights without the stressing duties. Most liberals believe that the people had the rights because they have the duties, and most very deeply interested in question of social justice." In the 19th century, liberal ethos was embedded to colonial case and a so-called standard of civilization thinking. Western modernity perceived the world through a prism of one universal civilization. The civilized core, the civilized world, the West was seen as surrounded by barbarians. The savages need to be civilized, or that civilized has a duty, and that's important, have a duty and right to civilize others. It was assumed that some peoples have developed further on, and that should enjoy more rights and create the same politics, but further on that civilized states were also seen to have the obligation to promote civilized norm and to prohibit uncivilized practices. And I think this if you look about 21st century liberal ethos, it has carried the same one world, one civilization legacy, often unintentionally but well visible in interpreting how responsibility to enhance peace, democracy, human rights is justified and relying on privileged knowledge, given right and duty. From that perspective, being a global do-gooder is a contradictory position and is necessary involves a privilege or even superior position that makes doing good obligation. Liberal ethos towards the peace promotion indicate epistemic kind of exceptionalism, as Julia Palmioni-Federer writes in his recent article, Diversity, Equality and Inclusion for Peace. And here I think that it is pointing out clearly that the professionalization and institutionalization of peace building has constituted an exclusive epistemic community that dominates what is required of peace. Even if the field has been adapted, I agree, it has also been reluctant for self-reflexivity regarding epistemological, ontological questions, and the construction of a knowledge, the political knowledge, and who produces it. The role of experts and epistemic communities have both supported the epistemic exceptionalism, which in my opinion always dated back to the origin of about the liberal ethos, how it was already in the 19th century. And that's why in the liberal ethos, it has not really been the liberal peace-building ethos to contest the deeply rooted double standard in which global north actors reflect problems at home and in the global south with a different vocabulary and terminology. Oliver Richmond, in his part, brought the question of knowledge production from perspective of the world ordering and peace intervention. He differentiated between three methodologies of a production of knowledge that are methodological nationalism, liberalism, and everydayism. Each of them constitute an ontological perspective knowledge production to guiding forms of practical intervention to maintain and extend existing order. Richmond writes that peace, quote, intervention offers emancipation from war, violence, structural violence, and cultural violence, but yet undermines sovereignty and subaltern claims for expanded rights. That is how explain the success of a liberal ethos or liberal peace. So That's why I think the critical literature on peace building has prioritizing the methodological everydayism as a way of departing from universal liberal ethos and a way to bypass its inherited asymmetry between superior external helper and a local victim waiting to be saved, and indeed enabling pluralistic perspective. If observing evolving multipolarity, similarly geopolitical and authoritarian shift is strengthening, not methodological everydayism. But I think that there are also contradictory examples available which are perhaps more encouraging than if you look about only things in one perspective or for Moscow, Washington or Beijing. But then bit on another issue. I think that the question about how to go over on this kind of a dichotomy between external helper, which have pose a right and duty and access to knowledge, and a passive victim waiting to be be saved. There are a lot of discussion has been going on during the past 20 years in liberal peace building discussion, and the practitioners indeed have trying to address also on the same question. How to go over? There are one kind of element is that the liberal peace building practitioners have been given a lot of interest to learn about how to learn about the local knowledge. The core problem for liberal peace building perspective is how peace building experts position themselves toward the exceptional local knowledge. Is it just access to society and for using local knowledge to win over the hearts and minds of recalcitrant subjects? John Law articulates liberal dilemma with pluriversality that is well identified also in peace building practice. Quote, if we are liberal, then we will respect the differences and we will not try to impose our own version of the world on those who see it differently. But even so, and however nice we are, we have not abandoned our basic commitment to the idea of a single all-encompassing reality. Neither have we really stopped assuming that aboriginal people have got it wrong, unquote. Critical peace building literature has been looking for alternate perspectives that give more emphasis on local, everyday experiences of peace. Still, and I'm still arguing with David Chandler, who provocatively writes, quote, these critical approaches are often drawn towards a pluralistic anthropological frameworks in order to develop an ethical methodology of intervention which can break free of hierarchical understandings explicit in liberal internationalism, but then epistemological privileging of a local knowledge then becomes a basis of value pluralism. And Sandel continues that no matter how culturally sensitive these interventions were, they still, and in fact inevitably, produce hierarchical understandings which problematize local understandings and values and came across as a patronizing and neo-colonial. And as Matthew pinpoints, quote, a local is indeed valued because it's difference, a difference that only becomes salient through the use of dominant peace-building frames. So liberal dilemma is not easy to dilute. Sandler himself introduced a resilience approaches, relying on philosophical pragmatism that enables policymakers to overcome this liberal peace paradox through focusing on transformative power of local practices and understandings, in fostering how everyday practices can provide resources to address problems faced. The problems and solutions are no longer debated in formal framing of export and liberal institutions, laws and rights. Instead, resilience approaches are based on how practice work in particular context and transformative agencies generated through practice. Paul Parkus describes pragmatic approach as a peace building without a peace, as there are no overarching understanding of a peace. Resilience approaches start from the assumption that there is no organic, cultural, or intersubjective construction of community, no authentic community or authentic source of knowledge. So then I want next to explain the idea of the pluriversality, because after explaining the exceptionalism of a liberal ethos, and I think that pluriversality represents a complete opposite from epistemological perspective for this kind of epistemological exceptionalism. And pluriversality, following the, for example, Milja Kurki, calls for a new relational perspective to represent many voices, experiences, and relational unfoldings. The notion of pluriverse moves us away from the idea that the world consists of the multiple voices in a single word was the project avoiding multiple words. John Law writes in his article, What's Wrong with the One World, that the differences are not simply a matter of belief, they are a matter of reals. He continues that people believe different things about the reality epistemologies, and there are different realities being done in different practices, ontology. Amaya Guer-Yasun explained the pluriversality coexistence of different religions in her weirdly endowed water covenants in very excellent way. The term is the title of article is misleading, but she tells how she intended to study of impact of international water covenants impact of international water comes to local communities in Bolivia, but how she ended to explore the different epistemologies about the water. She explains how that while international cooperation referred to water as a resource, an object of local communities use a different language. They talk about the breeding, nurturing, take care of water as an other than human person. Furthermore, and in local Aymara language, there was no one specific word of water, but used terminology is depending on what is happening or what the water is doing. The expression would change. The approach can be described as a relational cosmological to water, relational perspective knowing. Unfortunately, I don't have the similar kind of example about the peace building and a different kind of understanding of peace. I will explore that and I will find it for the next time. But I think this is excellent example. Pluriversality as a concept is often used as a counter-hegemonic argument to contest neoliberal hegemony. That's why there is a danger of essentialization and romanticization of indigenous as authentic side of silence knowledge and presenting oversimplified dichotomy between neoliberal and colonialist world. This kind of simplification ignores diversity of approaches. As Edward Said writes, all uniform configuration of civilization units are expressions of imperial legacy to eliminate the impurities and hybrids that make all cultures. There is no authenticity, but only different hybridizations. Furthermore, Rosalind Morris writes, there is neither authenticity nor virtue in the position of oppressed. There is simply, or not so simply, oppression. In a nutshell, pluriversality is a perspective or methodology to context one world approaches, or as a law put accepting a living in a fractiverse, whether there can be no overarching logic or liberal institution, diplomatic or otherwise, to mediate between the different realities. There is no overarching, instead there is contingent, more or less local and practical engagement. Guer-Yasun expresses epistemological paradox of pluriversality that understanding of the other worlds has necessary its limitation that we are not able to bypass. And quote, it is not possible to become fully Andean, fully Western, nor fully syncretic. Our identities are but our identities are in construct flow, and we are fractal beings. Furthermore, she continues, relationality enables the conversation with other worlds, pluralizing our ontological lexicon. It provides tools to both to do, learn, but also undo, uncover, unlearn, and to becoming familiar with the ambiguity and ambivalence. But she reminds, these processes of pluralization and disruption bring about more complexity and challenges without account for political and not only romanticized way of approaching the rationality. Pluriversality offers a valuable learning perspective, but how comprehend peace building within pluriversality or fractiverse? That escapes epistemological ontological certainties. I think in more generic terms, how we are enabled to preserve focus on peace within this epistemological complexity or epistemological mesh. We all do have our own values and understanding, and it's important we are honest to our own values, but remain open for other worlds. And in this case, I would suggest that to cope with the epistemological mess, but also the ethical uncertainty that it brings, we need to adopt an agonistic perspective, and that is important for that in that regard. Agonistic perspective may also offer a kind of ontological tool to cope with what I call as a Taliban paradox. Taliban represent a counter-hegemonic, local, indigenous approach indeed to peace, but still many of us probably would not accept its violent subordination of women as well as all kinds of minorities. Still, I cannot deny that for the many Afghans or Pashtuns, Taliban rules represent a redemption from war or Western rules. How we can take a critical perspective as a Taleban policy without lost back in epistemological exceptionalism of a liberal approach. And here also I think that the agonistic kind of perspective offers an answer to that. And then I use it the last part of one presentation to explaining the agonistic perspective, how it can perhaps offer a tool to coping with the pluriversality. It's a difficult word, pluriversality. I try to keep it in. So, to agonism, what is mean in one perspective of peace? I think there are several political, really classical philosophers who have referred to the agonism: Hannah Arendt, Michel Foucault, William Connolly, Bonnie Honing, and Chantal Mouffe. But the term agonistic peace was introduced by Rosemary Schinko in 2008. And for Schinko, agonistic peace was a way to think about the peace in more robust and political ways, as an active, provocative, engaged beyond the universalism of liberal approach. Schinko was inspired by Foucault's radically open-ended understanding of agonism, but the recent academic discussion on agonistic peace building, which I have been also engaged, have a look more inspiration from French philosopher Chantal Mouffe and her agonistic pluralism. For Mouffe, agonistic pluralism is focusing on how politics can deal with the threat of antagonism. She explored how to organize political interaction in a way that enables coping with antagonism or resentment, to prevent the emerge of a violent polarization or fundamentalism, and to transmute experiences of radical antagonism into agonism without subverting differences, without being lured back to the hegemony of antagonistic narratives. Furthermore, and it's important, Mouffe reminds that antagonism can never be eliminated, and it constitutes an ever-present possibility in the politics. So that's why the agonism in really contests the Kantian dream of a perpetual peace and declared it as utopistic. For Mouffe, a prerequisite for agonistic pluralism or peaceful society is an ensemble of practices, discourses, and institutions which seek to establish a certain order or agonistic relationship to enable a human coexistence in a condition that are always potentially conflictual. Transforming is then not unidirectional, transforming something from war to peace, but is comprehended as a constitutive, continuous, and contingent capability or virtue for agonistic politics to maintain self-sufficient peace. What distinguishes adversary from enemies is the relational aspect of respect or recognition. Mouffe argues that agonistic pluralism implies that the other them is depicted in such a way that it's no longer perceived as an enemy to be destroyed, but adversary, that is somebody whose idea we combat, but whose right to defend these ideas we do not put into question. According to Schinko, agonistic practices are formulated as a way to provide political spaces where the friend-enemy dichotomy can be overridden and reframed as an encounter between adversaries. Peace is then first and foremost practice, and peace can be found in practice. This resonates well also with the Elise Paulding's classical approaches to peace research, at least in my opinion. But also what inspired me about Emmanuel Adler's ideas about the practices. Adler defining kind of talking about how the peace kind of in context of a plural security kind of plural security communities. And a pluralistic security communities for Adler are community of practices in which prevails trust on that all conflict within community are addressed in peaceful terms. This kind of a community of practice is considered also a normative community. I think that the Adler's way of understanding and this kind of a peace community is too narrow, too perhaps state-centric. But I think that they have potentially that's why I'm thinking that agonistic practices are creating agonistic systems of a peace. So and it's more broader, and it's not necessarily a normative community. Besides the peace is about the practice and is in the practices, it's also certainly a relational. And I think that is connected well with agonistic thinking. And here and lately have been very much inspired by Chinese kind of IS scholars, Yaking Jin's ideas about the relational theories. And Jin's approach to relational theory has, I think it has roots in Chinese philosophy, in Confucian, but it's offering on this kind of ontological perspective to relate a kind of understanding relation which is easy to use also in the research, and I think it is understandable also in kind of designing on the peace building. For Jin, the relation is simultaneously a worldview, a way of thinking and doing. It is a perspective. From that perspective, relation or relationality is also a core unit of social scientific analysis. According to Jin, relational perspective enables better cover also pluralistic universalism, respect differences, and show tolerance and compassion, and are skeptical about the all absolute truths. And I think I agree. Social humans are, according to Jin, relational beings or simply relators, and thus communities are constituted by relations. Self-existence is simultaneous coexistence. Identity is formed through the relations, and therefore ontologic of coexistence comes before ontologic of existence. Everything is related to everything else, everyone to everyone else. Together they constitute the whole cosmos. Fully and dynamic relation provide dynamics of this cosmos. This kind of basically has similarities with the complexity theory, but I will not go in that direction. But I would argue that the peace is about the agonistic relation or agonistic coexistence and our agency located in agonistic practice of peace. So they are relational and practices. Okay, I'm coming on end. But then to conclude on bit in something, and I go a bit further on to think about what this means for the peace building. Move is talk about agonistic systems only within kind of existing agonistic kind of system. So he's talking about how they can prevail the agonistic kind of plurality. But agonistic peace building has focused on communities and society that lost their capacity to cope with the violent antagonism. And from agonistic peace building perspective, the core question then is both ontological and pragmatic, is how capability for creating and maintaining agonistic practices of peace can be revived when the violence has come to be understood as a legitimate practice of everyday politics and its institutional frames. Within conventional peace building, the dominant research interest has been how does emergence of antagonism generate conflict and how the one can solve it. But from agonistic perspective, the question is not solving antagonism. It's not about looking for kind of some kind of a solution or assume harmonious concepts. It's more about the kind of relating the parties. Than exists kind of looking some kind of a solution. As a core requirement for peace is not harmony or amity, but the relation aspect towards adversaries or potential enemy. Relating is probably expressed, and this relating through the various informal and embodied everyday practices and gestures instead of formal apologies and recognition. So agonistic peace does not offer overarching confirm, but instead emphasizes ability to cope with the uncertainty and practicability, but also messiness and the complexity of human relations. It acknowledges the imperfection and vulnerability of a peace while understanding the peace as relational about coexistence between humans that are always imperfect, whose relations always open to misunderstanding and misuse. But agonistic perspective also brings hope by giving emphasis to multiple agencies to generate situated agonistic systems, even there where the violent antagonism prevails. Instead of comprehensive peace processes, agonistic peace building design can be approached as a kind of diverse weave of various randomly connected attempts. In this context, the path towards the peace needs to be imagined more as a non-linear, small-step engagement with multiple agencies, giving more emphasis to local actors and existent, not necessarily connected layers. Peace building is necessary interaction among the different knowledge ecosystems, including peace building's own. An important question concerns this interaction, how to co-create peace among the actors and who understand the peace differently. Position of agonistic peace builder is vulnerable without epistemological conformity, is traumatizing as a peace builder need adopt agonistic perspective and within antagonist setting and bypass one's own values. To be creative peace builder need to be artisans combining creativity of artists with craftsmanship. This axis multi-layered peace ecosystem combines international NGOs or local actors also in the South-South axis offer important resources and hope for emergence of a new kind of agency. You are looking for that I'm coming over time. I will Yeah, I think that kind of given, and I wanted to end it with the one kind of we started with Russia and Ukraine. We coming with the agonistic systems of a peace and how we can find them. The thing that one thing is what I find it important, that we have a kind of, we can look about the agonistic system peace as a kind of a working, for example, democracy system, egalitarian systems, and then they are contrasting with strongly with the existing kind of autocratic imperial systems, where the peace is more or less of a control, it's a kind of violence, it's about the kind of it's a different kind of systems. But there are agonistic systems also within different kind of autocratic systems. So this is not something that it's not, you can find it or pocket the peace in everywhere. Within truly kind of violent autocratic systems, you can find it within them. And then the most interesting, which have been studied in recently about the power of agonistic, in many cases, agonistic systems are vulnerable in the face of a kind of autocratic aggressions, because they are not really friendly, but they are also very resilient systems. And I wanted to end with the kind of what I call the Ukrainian miracle. And I've been studying on that in recent years. So Ukraine, and this is really contrasting what Mr. Trump has been saying in recent years, it's been really a miracle how it managed to cope with the kind of the war years, especially the last 3 years of a large-scale interstate war. There usually the tendency that the states in the war are more turned inwards, are more adopting autocratic policies, are more kind of enhancing kind of a uniformalist kind of approaches, because it's already in survival kind of efforts. But Ukraine have managed to preserve a very strong democratic institutions, and not only on that, and that they've been developed a very kind of vivid and very important civil society actors who have been kind of complement on existing institutions, and then created a really functioning agonistic peace systems during the interstate war. Because of civil society actors, they were an internal kind of dialogue builders. They have created and systems that have managed for Ukrainian society to cope with the different kind of tendency for polarization, for unification, and internal problems. And this gave a hope also the future, that however the war will come end, there is a kind of this enabled all to step on the next phase, and given kind of a good future prospect also for the Ukrainians, even the things looks very gloomy at the moment. So thank you.